So hi everyone, my name is Maria. I'm really excited to be contributing to today's afikra Forward presentations. My presentation today is going to be about an article by Edward Said called Living in Arabic. It was first published in the Raritan, a quarterly review. So these two links, which I'll post in the chat at the end of my presentation, have the article itself. The first one is the original publication, which was in 2002, a bit dated, but I think you'll see that it's still quite relevant as we go through the presentation today. You do need a subscription for that first one, so the second one is an open access version that you can all access instead. So the article itself is written by Edward Said. He was a Palestinian-American academic, a literary critic, and a political activist. He was someone who was very interested in how social and cultural politics really influenced literature and the literary field in general. He himself was actually a professor of literature at Columbia University here in New York. And he was also someone who was very vocal about the need to establish Palestine as an independent state. So you can see he was really quite dominant in both the literary field, but also the political sphere as well. And his article, Living in Arabic, it starts off almost as a comparison of sorts between classical and colloquial Arabic. So for those of you who speak Arabic, you may be familiar with the fact that throughout the Arab world, there's quite a few dialects. They can be quite different. So if you grew up really only speaking and hearing one dialect, it can actually be quite difficult to understand some of the others. So his article really focuses on the fact that all of these dialects, they fall under the umbrella of colloquial Arabic, or like a more informal spoken Arabic, whereas your classical Arabic is the one that you're more likely to see in books, to see on the news, for example. So two quite different forms of the same language in a way. And to kind of highlight the difference between classical and colloquial, he gives the following example. Pre-1970s, a lot of the TV dramas and movies were produced out of Egypt, and they used the Egyptian dialect as a result. The topics themselves, as you can see from these movie posters, were a little risque for the time, which is perhaps part of the allure and the fact that they were as popular as they were. But they also did use the dialect, which, according to Said, is why so many of them remained as popular as they are even today. In comparison, around the 1970s and 80s, the oil boom in the Arab world led to a lot of dramas and movies now being produced in other countries as well. Now, they did tend to stick to more conservative topics, which may be why they weren't quite as popular. They also used more classical Arabic. And according to Said, this was a real big distinction between why one persisted in dominance in popular culture and the other one kind of took a backseat, and they really didn't become as popular in the end. So ultimately what Said is asking in this article is, why do we have this kind of distinction between when and how we use classical Arabic and when and how we use our more colloquial, informal Arabic? And according to Said, classical Arabic, it's really kind of your benchmark for good literature. So it's the common language of literary expression. And according to him, it's unmatched for precision of expression. So the ability to really be precise in what you're trying to say falls more to classical Arabic than colloquial. Even regional writers who were very proud nationalists of the countries that they would represent in the Arab world, they tended to stick with classical Arabic when they wrote. If anything, they would maybe use colloquial Arabic as part of their dialogue or part of their conversations, for example. But for the most part, it was really classical Arabic that dominated the world of literature. So at this point in his article, he tends to shift almost. It becomes a form of a love letter in a way for the classical Arabic language. And he really highlights at this point the beauty and the strength of the classical Arabic language and why it was able to persist for as long as it has. And it really comes down, according to him, to two main reasons. So the first is the structure of the language. So the structure of the language, for any of you familiar with it, it's really quite mathematical. It's almost like a formula in the way that it's built and the way that it's structured. So as a quick example to kind of highlight that point, on the right here, you'll see a picture of like a family tree that stems from three letters. Almost the majority of words in the Arabic language stem from a root that's made up of three letters. And depending on how you use the vowels in that word, and depending on any prefixes or suffixes you add to it, you can create a different word that traces its meaning back to the original root. So for example, here you have the three letters that form the word alima, or to know or to understand. And if you were to say add an M or the letter mim at the beginning, you now have muallim, or someone who helps you know or understand. So in that way, by really just knowing the root, you can actually know a wealth of vocabulary that really lets you access the language in a much more powerful and influential way that's based on an understanding of the actual structure, as opposed to a lot of words that aren't related. So that's the first reason why, according to Said, the Arabic language, the classical Arabic language, is so powerful. The second reason is because the language itself as a whole underwent a period of modernization in the late 19th century. This was a time period that was called the Nahda, or the Arab Renaissance. And during this time period, a group of men from Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, and Egypt actually used the same laws, the same structure of the Arabic language that had been used up to that date, but they used it to now introduce new vocabulary. So with all of the new modernization of the time period, they found that the language kind of lacked in some of the vocabulary that was needed. Even words like democracy didn't really have a parallel in the Arabic language at the time. So by using the same structure and following those same formulas, they were actually able to introduce a whole wealth of vocabulary into the language. And around 60% of the vocabulary that we use today in Arabic actually stems from the vocab that was introduced at that time. So Said points out that some people criticize classical Arabic as saying it's outdated, it needs a renewal of sorts. And he points out that most of them probably aren't aware that the language already underwent that particular period of modernization and renewal. And that's why it's able to stand the test of time and still be in such prevalent use today. So at this point, Said kind of ends his article by asking, what does it mean to live in Arabic? And even though his whole article really was about the beauty and the strength of classical Arabic, he's not discounting the beauty and the strength of colloquial Arabic as well. Instead, what he's really saying is that to live in Arabic means that you're able to flow easily between classical and colloquial, between formal and informal, and to know when and how to use each one depending on your point and your purpose. He noted that several political leaders, such as Jamal Abdel Nasser from Egypt, were actually really quite adept at this, because they would be giving a speech to the masses in colloquial Arabic. So they would be, addressing themselves as one of the people. But then when they wanted to make a point that was really eloquent, they really wanted to send a point home, they would switch just for a moment into classical Arabic instead. And it was this ability to flow between the two that was really what Edward Said believes is the purpose of living in Arabic. As someone who grew up in the West, speaking really only Lebanese colloquial Arabic, I remember when I would talk with my cousins who grew up in Lebanon, who were much younger than me, and they would be able to speak classical Arabic because they were learning it in school. I always used to think it was, just such a beautiful language. And they would always laugh and say, it's so nerdy. It's not really a language that we use in daily life. But this article, for me at least, was really kind of eye-opening in how we perceive these two aspects of essentially the same language. So finally, just a couple of resources for any of you who are interested in reading a bit more about this. As I mentioned, Said was really well known in both political and literary spheres. So even his passing was covered by the New York Times. So there's an article there on him. His most famous book was called Orientalism. So that's listed there as well, if any of you would like to have a look at it. Similar to the idea of just the importance of kind of preserving one's own language, there's a really good TED Talk by Suzanne Talhout called Don't Kill Your Language. A bit dated as well, I think from 2013, but still really relevant and really good. And then finally, for those of you who may have been interested in that time period called the Nahda, or the Arab Renaissance, I've listed a couple of resources there as well. So hopefully they'll provide some good further resources for any of you who are interested in reading more. And thank you. I look forward to any questions at the end.